right, brain development. A lot is happening in the first 2 years, but we already learned in chapter 4 that just 25 days after conception, the neural tube has already formed, and the central nervous system is already evident with the development of the hindbrain, then the midbrain, and by the time the end of the third trimester occurs, you already have the forebrain developed. Now, development of the brain is not going to stop there. As a matter of fact, at birth, the baby is born with 25% of their adult weight brain already completed. Now, to get to 100, they still have the rest of their life. But in the first 2 years, they will achieve 50% more of that development. So the baby will go from 25% at birth to 75% by the end of age 2. That is an amazing growth in the first 2 years, to think that the brain is already 75% developed. How? What is happening? This is what we will discuss in the next slides. The forebrain, which is, like I said, the last part to develop and the one that will continue to develop well into adolescence and perhaps adulthood, is basically accounting for 2/3 of the brain mass. So we started with the central nervous system is the spinal cord and the brain. The brain is divided into three parts. The hindbrain, which is basically your primitive brain. This is what's in charge of things that you have no control over, like your breathing and your heartbeat, just keeping you alive. Basically, that's why it's primitive. And then the development of the forebrain, and then the midbrain, sorry, and then finally the forebrain. The forebrain, as you can see, is the biggest part. And this part is divided into two hemispheres. Those two hemispheres are pretty much connected to each other, and they are communicating with each other in order to control the rest of your body. How are they connected? Well, they're connected through this band of neurons. It is an area in the brain called the corpus callosum. We're going to talk a lot about this, but this is just a little bit of anatomy of the brain, so that you know when we refer to the hemispheres, when we talk about the corpus callosum, when we talk about the cortex and the specialization of the brain, what are we referring to? So brain mass this is just the forebrain. This is just the top area. This area is divided into two hemispheres, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, connected with a band of neurons. And this connection is very important to communicate between the two parts. The outermost layer, the top area that we call gray matter, is basically the area of specialization. It's divided into 4 areas, and each area is in charge of receiving particular signals from your body. So if your body was to send, let's say, a signal to the brain to be translated that has to do with vision, it would arrive at the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is right in the back of your skull, right there. So if you get a hit on the head in the back, it's very detrimental because you might be losing your eyesight. All right, on the sides of your skull, there's one on this side, one on this side. There is the temporal lobe, and those are in charge of hearing and language and a part of the memory. And then we have the top area right there on top of your head is what we call the parietal lobe. And this is in charge of, like I said, many areas of specialization. Smell, touch, social understanding are some of them. And then comes the biggest part of that cortex, and that is dedicated to the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is one of the last areas to develop, especially that most front area that lays right under your forehead, and that is the prefrontal cortex. This is the area that is the most sophisticated. As you can see, we said that the bottom part of the brain, the hindbrain, is the most primitive. This is what regulates basic things. And the foremost area, the one that develops last, the one that is the most sophisticated, is the one that is dedicated to what makes us really human. It specializes in anticipation, planning, impulse control, how we can imagine things and decide things and coordinate things. And that's why it takes time to develop. You can pretty much tell the difference between a 2-year-old and a 20-year-old or a 27-year-old in the development of the prefrontal cortex, because each age comes with different liabilities and abilities when it comes to decision making. All right, so let's continue to work on some terminology that is going to be important. The central nervous system, we said, was starting in the womb, and it is ultimately a spinal cord and a brain, and the communication between the two of them. In order for my spinal cord to deliver a message from the brain, it needs to use some sort of a vehicle, and this vehicle is what we call the neurons. Neurons are basically nerve cells that are designed to transmit the information to the parts of the body. It could send it to another cell, it could send it to a muscle, it could send it to a gland in order to produce some hormone. So it's basically the communication tool from your brain to the rest of your body. Let's zoom in on a neuron and what it's made out of. Every single neuron is made out of two very important parts that you need to remember. The most important one is the dendrite. The dendrite is the end of the neuron that is in charge of receiving the messages. So the message comes through dendrites. These branches that are coming out are basically receptacles of the impulses, the electrochemical impulses that are transmitted from another axon. All right, now the axon is the tail end, kind of, the bottom piece, or the tail of the neuron, and this is how it transmits its electrochemical impulses. So a neuron sends messages through the axon, receives messages through the dendrite. This transaction happens. Here is an example of one neuron and another neuron. As you can see, the tail end is sending, and the head, where the nucleus is, receiving. All right, now this transaction does not happen by touching. None of the neurons touch each other. Instead, they come really close to each other. The end of a dendrite and then the end of an axon come very close to each other, and in between them, there is an area of transmission. This is the area where all the work happens, and this is what we call synapse. This is the connection. This is the field that the connection is happening. And this intersection between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron is how those little bubbles, neurotransmitters, are basically little bubbles of chemicals that are going to pretty much jump into the other one, kind of squirt out the information and jump back in again. So this transmission is how the messages, the impulses, are going from one neuron into the other. Now this neuron is going to either go straight to another neuron through a web of connections like in this picture, or it could be connected to a body part, or like we said, to a gland or a cell, and so forth. The connections are going to be improved the more we use them. So it's kind of like a road. The more you travel that road, the better, the easier it becomes, and the stronger it's going to become. Your brain is going to figure it out that, I guess, you need this connection, you need this road to be better. So I'm going to help you by adding a material that makes the transmission much faster, and this is what we call myelination. Myelination is the process of coating the axon with a material, a fatty material, a protein and fat material called myelin. Myelin increases the speed of that transmission, so the message goes faster. So instead of taking a while for you to um, receive and send a message, it happens instant, it happens faster. And that's why with myelination we can achieve better reaction time. So myelination, which is again a fatty sheath that covers those neurons, the axon of a neuron, is going to be the primary reason for that weight of the brain that is going to increase. When we go from 25% of its weight to 75% of its adult weight, what's happening is a lot of myelination of those connections, those neural connections within the circuits of the brain. Now, when you are born, you're born with a lot of neurons that developed in the womb that you will not keep as you continue to develop and grow. You are born with far more than what you need. And in the first couple of years, there's going to be even more happening that that will later on be regulated by the experiences that you have. So an operation or a process that takes place in the first couple of years is called transient exuberance. And transient meaning it's a temporary experience that you're going to go through. Your brain is going to go through a temporary experience of rapid increase of connections or synapses. So transient exuberance is basically the great but temporary dendrite growth that develops in an infant's brain during the first 2 years. So a lot of dendrites are going to be extended out of each neuron. It's kind of like, I'm ready. I have all the branches coming out. They're growing just in case you need them. I have them. There's a lot of them coming out. But are we going to keep all of them? No, we're not going to keep all of them, because that process is going to be followed by another process called synaptic pruning. The synaptic pruning is basically this, think of this as the neuron, and it grew so many dendrites in the first 2 years in case you're going to need them. But then based on your experiences, you might not end up needing all of those little extras. So instead of your brain having this bushy connection inside, there is another natural process that's going to take place, and that is synaptic pruning. Those synapses that did not get activated, did not get used, are now going to wither and die. They're going to be pruned, literally like a gardener pruning a tree to make the roots and the branches and the health of the tree much stronger. So synaptic pruning is a process by which unused connections in the brain are going to die. Now, what you want is just the right amount of pruning to make things clear and strong. What you don't want is a vital connection to be pruned because you did not use it. So this is where we go to experience. So the brain is born ready for experiences, ready to receive and connect and strengthen those connections, ready to myelinate those vital connections that are built into the dendrites and into the neural network. But if the brain is not exposed to those connections and experiences, they might suffer. So the brain has certain functions that are called experience expectant growth, meaning that the brain is going to crave, is born ready to receive seeing things, learning a language, being loved and touched and cared for. And if you don't give those experiences, the brain is going to suffer. This is what we meant by you don't want vital connections to be killed. And that's where, when we talk about the effects of toxic stress on the developing brain, we say that once we damage those connections, we do not have attachment in early years, we don't have that nurture in early years, the child might suffer. If I take a child and I deprive them of learning a language or hearing human language, which actually have been the case in certain cases of abuse, then the brain has a very hard time recovering from that. It's never possible after that. Even if there is a little bit of increase or evidence of recovery, it's not a full, it's kind of like a now or never kind of thing. Seeing things, your brain is ready to see things. It doesn't matter what it sees, but it's ready to see. And that's why you have a complete section in your brain that is ready for visual reception. And of course, to be loved, touch, and the importance of touch and connection. That is also something that is built into your brain. The other type of functions are those that are basically dependent on what type of experiences we have. So those are not as detrimental as those. Those are ones that are going to make you, you, and make me, me. So brain functions that depend on particular experiences that could very well be you. We both saw things through our childhood, but you were brought up in Alaska and you got exposed to certain things that have to do with nature that me, born in the Sahara Desert, did not get to see. But both of us saw things that our brain developed, but it developed a little bit different. So that experience dependent growth is not going to affect the health of the brain. It just shows that the structure of the brain is different. The connections that were activated were different than mine. A perfect example of experience dependent growth is speaking different languages. So here, your brain is ready to learn language, but the dependent one is on what type of language I am going to activate, which connections are going to be activated, which letters I'm going to be able to pronounce. And this is why this experience is not going to deprive my brain of anything. It's just going to make my brain structure different than yours. My brain was structured to speak French, your brain was structured to speak Japanese. So experience expectant growth, experience dependent growth are both functions that the brain needs, but some of them are one way, I guess you can say. If you don't expose the brain to it, there's a harm, and the other one, there's just a different type of development that's going to occur. As we mentioned, connection is very important, and seeing is something that is brain expectant. All infants need to see things, right? This is something that the brain is built to have. Now, the difference is, who do they see? What does the brain learn about what they're seeing? So one area in the brain tells us that brains are already structured to recognize human faces. There's an area in the brain that's called the fusiform face area, and this area gets only activated, and we know this from MRIs and fMRIs. We have an in on the inside development of the brain. We can actually see brain waves and activation of this area only when the infant was looking at a face. And that activation did not occur when the baby looked at, let's say, a block or a monkey. So human faces are actually, the ability to recognize human faces is has its own specialized area in the brain. Now, what's noteworthy here is that the brain gets experienced in seeing familiar faces, and that's why when we expose the child to certain faces, let's say the face of a mom, the brain is already building within that experience dependent structure a familiarity with that perception. And that's why they might, by age 3, smile at certain faces than others. So the familiar face kind of triggers the memory of, oh, I know that's mom's face, versus an unfamiliar face might not trigger that same memory, because the brain has already gone through the experience expectant part, which is seeing, and now is becoming more structured or customized to seeing certain faces, and that is mom's face. What happens if we harm that brain? What can we do to harm that brain? Well, we can do a lot to harm that brain if we're not conscious about how important stimulation is. So the brain is expecting those experiences, the brain is craving those experiences. So if I do not stimulate the brain with sights and sounds and emotional expression and touch and interaction and reciprocal interactions, then the brain is deprived. Then those connections are going to wither and die. Stress also has a major effect on the brain, and I've attached a couple of videos that I want you to watch. It summarizes this concept beautifully, and you can see the effect of the overproduction of cortisol, the stress hormone, and how if it floods a normal brain, it interferes with development and could actually reduce the amount of myelination, and the size of the brain therefore suffers. Stress can also affect the caregivers, and we said in chapter 4 that postpartum depression is a real thing, and it's an area that parents need to pay attention to, because what happens is that you have a stressed parent that's caring for a very vulnerable being. And what happens in some incidents is that that stress could lead to the parent maybe holding the baby, trying to comfort them or control their crying. And instead of gently rocking them to sleep, they might actually forcibly shake the baby back and forth. Now, what happens when you shake a baby back and forth and they have a very heavy size wise to the rest of their body, the proportion is not the same. The brain and the weight is much heavier than the rest of the body. The neck cannot carry that. So what happens is that it's literally like shaking an egg. The brain is inside the eggshell, and it's being shaken every time that baby's head is shaken back and forth. That motion could end up rupturing blood vessels inside the brain and creating a leakage inside. This is a life-threatening injury that sadly shows up in ERs, and when they do, they are indicative of abuse, and could very well be a reason for an ER nurse or a doctor to call the cops. So it is a life-threatening injury that could lead to death, and in many cases leads to intellectual impairment, because those severed blood vessels cannot be removed. Some infants end up being immobile or blind, or they end up suffering, surviving the incident, but suffering later on in life intellectually.